The second quarter GDP growth is impressive, 4.1%. Now, there are several one-time factors that are contributing to this, but I want to take a look at what GDP is and why quarterly figures alone have to be looked at in context. GDP, look, it's much more complicated than this. I know some of you are going to get angry that I put such a short description. Gross domestic product is basically the total value of everything produced by everybody and every company in the country. It's a big scorecard of the country's economy. Now, we have seen high rates like this before. In fact, we've seen higher quarterly growth rates during the Obama administration. Quarterly growth reached 4% or higher 4 times during the Obama administration. It actually got above 5% at one point in 2014. But this is the highest since 2014. The annual GDP growth rate never broke 3% under President Obama. And I tend to like to look at this one a little more. The last time we saw that kind of growth was during the Bush administration, 3.3% back in 2005. Right now, Federal Reserve officials forecast GDP to be up by 2.8% compared to last year for all of 2018, then to tail off to 2.4% in 2019 and 2% in 2020. Now, I have seen numbers that are higher estimates for this year than 2.8%. I'm going to call it 3 for argument's sake, but that's probably a number that you should be thinking about. Now, the boost in recent months, the one that we just got today, was fed in part by spending from consumers and businesses and a rush from farmers getting their soybean exports, for instance, into the global market ahead of new tariffs. So for those of you out there asking if the 4.1% rate can sustain itself through the rest of the year, that is an open question. Joining me now from the White House is Kevin Hassett. He is the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and he is a good friend of mine and a conservative, but I also know liberal economist. And Jared Bernstein, who is, I know, a friend of yours as well, liberal economist, is standing by. I'm going to talk to him afterwards. But the danger for you, Kevin, is that you have somebody smarter than me listening into this conversation. Because you can normally walk all over me.
Jared there.
Let me ask you this. The reason Jared's significant in this conversation is back during the Obama administration, they would trumpet reports on job creation or the effect of the stimulus, and I would do to them exactly what I'm doing to you. I would question them. I would say that perhaps they are rosier than they think. And Jared, like you, has invited me to the White House to examine the books and to make your case. Now, in this particular case, 4.1% is solid growth. But as I noted, some of it was fueled by farmers getting rid of soybeans. There isn't some crazy increased demand for soybeans around the world. So do you look at 4.1% and think that is sustainable, or should we talk about 2.83%?
Well, I think you're right to get a little bit anxious about focusing on only one number. And I got to also add that Jared has, over the years, taken a lot of guff from conservatives about the first forecast that he and Christy Romer did about what the economy would be if we passed the stimulus. And, you know, I think that a lot of that criticism was really unfair because they had to close, as I did with the economic report of the president, close the forecast before they got a whole bunch of really bad data. And so that they're, you know, for sure they would have changed their numbers if they had the data available when their forecast came out. And since they didn't, they looked a lot worse than really they were. And I think that's unfair. And so for me, though, thinking about just what I'm doing right now here at the White House, that when I took the job, the president basically said, Kevin, you know, don't spend the American people. Pick the models that you think are best for modeling things, and then go out there and believe that what you're saying is true about what it's going to do to the economy. And you know that that's what I've been doing all the way back to the fall. And last fall, you know, I said on this show that if we passed the tax cut, that our forecast would become true, which is that we'd have growth this year of 3.1%. Not ridiculous growth, not above 4 like we saw today, but 3.1. If you average the two numbers for the first half of the year, it's 3.1. Right.
Okay, so fair enough.
That's pretty good. So I think totally 3.1 is still a good guess for the year.
I'm fine with the Fed's forecast, which is 2.8, because these numbers are stronger. So maybe it'll be 3, maybe it'll be 3.1. But I guess the concern I have is how to make this make sense for the American people. Because when the president ran for office, you weren't involved at the time. When the president ran for office, here's what he said.
We're bringing it from 1% up to 4%, and I actually think we can go higher than 4%. I think you can go to 5 or 6%.
Right.
That's my problem, because we're not actually talking about annual GDP growth of 4, 5, or 6%. at all. You and I have had this conversation. I think I once promised to wear a dress for a week if certain predictions came true.
I really don't want it to happen.
We don't want that to happen. I've said that I will grow an afro if we get to 4, 5, and 6%.
That would be fun.
It would be, it would be fun to have 4, 5, or 6%. But that's not really a reasonable expectation.
Well, no, I think that you can have a quarter like that. And let's go back to today's numbers. That there are a lot of signs of serious momentum in the data. First, the capital spending boom is continuing. But second, a reduction in inventories took about 1% off of the GDP number. And so if we had normal inventories, then it would have actually been a 5% number, like the president said. And as you know, if you have firms running down their inventories in one quarter, then that's pretty optimistic for the second half of the year. And so I think that having 3.1 over the first half of the year and having the second quarter be above 4 with a sort of minus 1% from inventories means that the CEA is still really, really comfortable that 3.1 is a very conservative estimate for the year as a whole.
CEA is your group, the Council of Economic Advisors.
Right.
The president, interestingly, has chimed in the last couple of weeks about interest rates, apparently warning the Fed to be careful about the increase in interest rates. Are you comfortable with the president chiming in on that sort of thing?
Absolutely 100% respect the independence of the Fed, and I have all the regard in the world for Jay Powell and our other nominees to the Fed, and the president does too. I think that independence absolutely 100% has to be respected religiously, but it doesn't mean that you can't provide your own analysis of the public sphere. A few months ago, I got criticized because I was on stage and I said something which I believe my whole life, which is I'm not really sure there is a NARU, a natural rate of unemployment. If you have a natural rate of something and it changes all the time, and how natural is that, right? But after I said that on stage, then Bloomberg, I think it was, ran a story that I'm attacking the Fed. And I think that kind of conversation, of course, should be permitted so that we can, say, hey, here's how I'm seeing it. But in the end, they have to make the call. They have to vote on interest rates, and they need to do it without political influence.
I have often said, I've said it to you, I've said it to Jared Bernstein, that the president gets too much credit and too much blame, in some cases, any president, for jobs and sometimes for economic growth. But the president, and he deserves credit where credit is due, but if this slowdown gets triggered by a trade war, does the president have to take responsibility for that?
The president has said forever, and you and I have talked about it, that he wants better trade deals. And if you look at all the positive movement with the EU this week, then you can see that his strategy of being tough and having credible threats and then collegially inviting people to the table is definitely working. And I think that, as you mentioned, the trade deficit dropped sharply in the second quarter, and some of that was anticipatory, as you mentioned, soybeans and the like. But it's also, I think, partly that we're open again for business. We've become a really attractive tax climate. And maybe people are a little worried about, what's going to happen to trade policy in the future, and so they're moving their production home in advance of something that they might be anxious about.
What has to happen?
But you can't argue with the results, though, right? The trade deficit dropped a lot.
The one result that's problematic is that wage earners are not earning more money. Hourly wages are not improving, and we do have a little bit of, we got interest rates going up, we've had oil prices going up. How do we fix that?
That's something that at CEA we're working really hard on, and I'm going to pretty soon, I'm about to go off to Tokyo for a week, but when I come back, Ali, I'll come on your show and present some new analysis that we've been doing to look at how the stampede of workers back into the labor force has increased the pool of low-skill workers, and that has lowered the average wage, even while there's wage growth that's starting to really pick up for people who are like were in before and are in now. And one of the ways you can see income, go look at the GDP release today, and you do all these really awesome explainers, and look at what happened to gross domestic income, because income was really, really revised up over the last few years, so much so that the savings rate just about doubled. That's how much income they found. And so a lot of the disappointing income statistics in the GDP releases, at least, are starting to be fixed because they're finding income that they had mismeasured before. And I think that if you account for compositional changes and then also account for these new data that we're finding that shows skyrocketing incomes, that the story is going to be a lot better. But final thought, in the end, the wage growth from capital spending is something that's a medium-term phenomenon, something you should see over 3 to 5 years, as I've reiterated all the way back to the fall.
Okay, optimistic, but thank you for all your stuff, Kevin.
Thanks, Ali.
Good to see you. Kevin Hassett.
Have a good one.
All right, joining me now, as promised, Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and former Chief Economist to Vice President Joe Biden. And I should say that I first got to know Jared because we had an argument about my characterization of things that you and the Obama administration were saying, and you invited me to sit and discuss that with you at the White House. So just so viewers understand, I'm an equal opportunity critic of administrations providing rosy narratives about the economy. Help us understand what we're looking at when we get this 4.1% figure. The president argues that, as did Kevin, that tax cutting and regulation cutting is delivering results. Do you agree?
I don't agree with that last part. If you actually look into the guts of the report, you don't see much from the tax cuts in the sense that I think Kevin was trying to stress, this idea that it's really increasing the investment or the economy's capital that it will use to generate more growth. There's a little bit of that, but that's not the big story. I think where the tax cut and some of the other deficit spending is helping is more in a Keynesian stimulus sense. It's juicing GDP growth this quarter, probably this year and next year as well. And then, unless Congress puts more fiscal stimulus on the credit card, it will probably fade. And I think you showed some of those numbers. The idea that GDP is going to sustain a 4 or even a 3% growth rate is probably much too optimistic. I think the underlying trend right now, and that's really important to try to pull out the trend, is about 2.5%. And that's a good, steady GDP growth rate. I also don't think there's anything in this report that would lead you to get worried about overheating that the Fed would have to react to. I do think the one problem, and you and Kevin talked about it, and I disagreed with this part of Kevin's rap, was the wage part. I don't think you're going to make the real wage stagnation go away by kind of, looking at the workers who are entering the workforce and their different qualities.
Yeah, this is fundamentally all of this economic mumbo jumbo that you and I enjoy and Kevin enjoys. What it comes down to, and what I'm going to get tweets about, is I haven't had the raise. I'm working 2 jobs. It's a weird situation to be in, where we have 4% unemployment, we have a 4 in front of GDP growth, quarterly GDP growth, and yet we've got this intractable problem of workers who are not seeing what they look at in the stock market, what they look at in GDP growth. How do we fix that?
Well, there's a word for that, and it's called economic inequality, and it certainly predated Kevin Hassett and the Donald Trump administration. This has been a structural problem in our economy, and you ask how we fix it, that's exactly the right question. It has to do with the bargaining power of middle and low-wage workers. That's a long-term erosion. It has to do with diminished union power. It has to do more recently with court decisions that really tilt against workers and their ability to claim their fair share of the growth. It has to do with the increased power of finance. I think it does have to do with the fact that we've run large trade deficits for many, many years, and that's hurt our manufacturers. So there's a lot of economic policy architecture that's eroded the connection between GDP growth and middle-class paychecks.
Which is also what you can say about the stock market, right? People used to think if the stock market's up the way it's been for the last year and a half, you should have higher wages.
Just a quick comment here. And I think that what's so key about this is to understand GDP growth in context. We like that 4% number, even if it's just a blip and not that sustainable. We even like the 2.5% trend growth rate. But let's not over-interpret GDP to be more than it is. It leaves out a lot, including who's getting the benefits of that growth.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.